I guess what I really am interested to know is whether this sense of magical transformation that I read in the work has its origin in something that led you to wish to become an artist in the first place.
No, I don't think so. I think a sense of wonder has always been kind of behind my interest in first off the natural world and then kind of exploring forms, finding shapes, generating ideas. I've always thought that, whatever, culturally, I guess, socially, I'm a real product of people who grew up in the 60s, and that kind of, you know, exploratory, vaguely kind of magical stuff that is the background to a lot of the music and, events of the 60s. I think I just absorbed that. I didn't have there's no one event or thing that happened that, made me more kind of interested in that way of expressing myself than another thing. It's just something that's kind of grew out of it naturally. I can only point to one or two kind of, main teachers who kind of maybe helped me focus on that whatever, that sensation or that thought, that idea of being able to find wonder in the most mundane things. Certainly one of the teachers, liberal arts teachers at OCAD, Archie Graham, his some of his ideas around you don't really need to look anywhere to find something magical. It's all around you. That cemented, I think, feelings that had kind of been bubbling away for a long time. But the idea that transformation, is kind of at the heart of art, it has always been kind of very important to me.
You just mentioned nature on the one side and music on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And these are very much, I guess, as you were saying, aspects of the early 60s, at least, with the Back to the Land movement, and of course the emergence of groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and such.
Mm-hmm.
Would you pinpoint nature and the music of the 60s as, you might say, well, as you said, a kind of encouragement?
Yes, I guess the music for sure, because I just was surrounded by it, grew up with it, and developed a love for all things kind of related to it as I've continued to explore that. But nature, I've never lived in the country. I've never felt like I needed to go out and commune with nature. The nature I've experienced has always been kind of the suburban version of it, and my kind of fascination with the fact that we've always truncated or tame it or hybridize it. I've always been fascinated in that aspect of it. On one side, the idea that the bonsai tree is a kind of wonderful way to transform nature, and that the suburban front yard is kind of, for some people, a horrible way to transform it or tame it in some way. I've kind of always been fascinated with that because that's what I've grown up around, and those rhythms and patterns that are easy to kind of graft onto natural phenomena. We all do. Artists, that's often where they start as a jumping off point, finding a way to see natural phenomena. I've always been connected to that. That's been a basic way to express myself in some way. The music, I mean, it's just a part of the rhythm of life. As I just explore it continually, it never stops giving.
I'm interested, actually, in how you understand the contribution an artist can make.
Yeah, I think it's profound and subtle at the same time. I think art can be just viewed as a kind of, what do you call it, edutainment, It's entertaining, it's educational, but it's not going to have a major transformational view. But I often think artists think at a strange and kind of deep level, that they're more prone to thinking about things on that kind of pre-linguistic visual level, which, you know, is like a really kind of weird, deep level. They're fascinated by that. They feel like their experience of consciousness is something they want to share with people, that they're able to comment on some of the on those things. So on one idea, I guess it's really kind of profound, that is, right? Because it's so elemental, the way you're trying to express things that maybe no one saw, in the way that you've seen it, or you feel that there's an urgency to express that, your experience of the world. But on another hand, it's completely useless and worthless, and without any, you know, without any value in a big part of society. A lot of people like it because it's attractive, or because it's fascinating, or because it's humorous, and that's as deep as it goes for some people. You know, for other people, it's the be-all and end-all of, you know, their reality, right? That if they're not engaged in it, they feel like they're missing something. So I think, I mean, artists, I think, and I've always kind of thought, you know, from the evolutionary standpoint, art's about mental gymnastics and mental flexibility, and it gives us new avenues to think about things. And that's deep. But on the other side, ultimately, you know, it's easy to translate it into a capitalist kind of thing. It becomes about owning those ideas, and it's a way for the non-creator often to come into contact with those things and kind of share in the sense of wonder. So I think artists promote wonder, promote exploration, promote, you know, interest in maybe things that no one ever thought were interesting before, or they continually do it for a new generation. They do it on a, you know, on an ongoing basis. You know, we're doing it in the space we're in right now. People were doing it 200 years ago in the space they were in, and is there any, maybe no difference really in our job, I guess, if we look at that as our vocation or job. That you know, that I'm not sure if that's, you know, the right kind of way to think about it. I do have a very cynical side of me that kicks in every once in a while about art's value to society, and I think that's largely based on capitalist forces that move it around, that kind of stuff. So, so that does exist as well. Mm-hmm. But I don't find it too hard to get to the positivity of it. You know, it's become a practice for me, and you know, I've grown up completely a-religious. There's absolutely none of that in my life. So I think it's actually become something that's become a substitute in terms of a place to take thoughts, to take energies, to take ideas and express them and think about them, you know, on a level that's different than the everyday level, even though it can be completely mundane at the same time and just as meaningful. So
that raises, I think, I'm not sure if it's a profound question or a difficult question. Maybe it's an easy question, which is really about the core focus that you understand your work to center around. And if I may, I'd just like to read something that Pearl Van Geest has actually written here. And she's quoting you.
Oh.
Evans says that he is trying to explain, and this is where the quote starts actually, to explain mysterious forces and give them structure. That in painting, he is speaking in code for something fundamental that is just outside of one's grasp. Would that be an adequate way of trying to assemble a thought about what is core to the work?
Yeah, I think so. You know, that sense of, you know, a life force or an energy kind of moving through the world, whether it's, you know, that slow kind of serpentine thing that, you know, people have talked about, or just our sense of being alive in the world. You know, you can look at it of us putting it onto the world, obviously, or the world kind of containing it. I think it depends where your viewpoints lie, but that the idea of there being, you know, a life force or an energy, it's not hard to feel that as a living, breathing human. Mm-hmm. And I've often looked at my interest in creating, you know, visual imagery as a bit of a dialogue between the outside and the inside, and this sense of our energy moving towards it and that energy kind of coming back at us, and just trying to find a way to map or chart that in some way. And I've just chosen the kind of shapes and forms that I've chosen. I don't even know why they've why that happened. I'm a kind of accidental landscape artist. That's what way I consider myself. But I find that there is something that is continually beyond our grasp, that we get a hold of every once in a while, and we hope to kind of express, and then all of a sudden we lose it. A friend of mine talking about archetypes and myths and stuff, and he said archetypes. He says, I always think of archetypal things as the great forgetting. We never can quite remember the energy behind it. I thought that's a really interesting way of putting it, because you could turn it around and say it's something we can never really grasp, yet it kind of frames a lot of stuff in a way. So, what that energy is, it's a romantic notion, there's no doubt about that. I'm a totally kind of romantic artist in the true sense of the word. It could be an escapist kind of place to go to find that. But it's something that's always been present, and I've always wanted to try and kind of harness or find a way to talk about. And like I said, it just turns into shapes and colors and movements and a sense of becoming, a sense of expansion, a sense of both motion and stillness simultaneously. I've always found those kinds of things fascinating, because I can feel them, right? There's a sense of that. There's some core experience that you can translate into a visual idea, So, the quote makes it sound a little more. She obviously has pared down my words there, and that's good. But I agree with that. I just don't really know how to explain it anymore. The idea that there's a mystery at the heart of art, which makes it interesting, I think is, that's a pretty fundamental concept. But maybe it's one of its more profound concepts too.
Well, which leads me actually, Gary, since we're in your studio, and you are in fact quite nicely poised in front of one of your works.
You're right.
Whether given the a sense of I don't know, mystery perhaps around this question of what is fundamental, I wonder, would it be possible to think about the painting that's here in the studio, and in a way parse how you come to make that painting, what the processes were.
Okay.
If you can adequately address that.
Yeah, I've gone through periods where specific locations and places have been really important and have been kind of jumping off spots to start a process. And I've gone through periods where the outside world is something I've just experienced but never thought that specific place needs to be expressed. And so a lot of the work on the other side of the studio is just about forms and shapes that exude a sense of general place and landscape, whereas this has a very specific place in it, and it's somewhere that I'd encountered just on my daily kind of travels, going to school. So there's a little vignette in the middle of a black building that is a space I would encounter just from parking a car here and looking across and just taking pictures of it, and so it just became a place that I've been a lot. And so trying to evoke that landscape, and this is a manufactured plastic urban landscape, which to me seems like a giant ready-made sculpture, a fascinating one. It also has its despicable kind of box store kind of characteristics to it that a lot of people find really, really horrid. I kind of find it fascinating in its manufactured quality. So that grew out of trying to get a sense of, being in that place, and at the same time being in my interior experience of the world. And so the imaginative shapes which grow out of forms in the environment become this kind of bridge to communing with an exterior space. And I've that in-between thing where imagination is what dictates what the form becomes before we get to the actual form that is the generating kind of element in it is something that I think a lot of my work has probably kind of danced around a little bit. So I'm often thinking, about the picture frame, about the kind of depth of field, about perspective, distance, about what that's historically about making pictures, putting ourselves in an imaginary world, or in a world that seems real but isn't. So playing with some of the ideas around that, around the modern ideas of flatness and the kind of older ideas of perspective, and trying to find some way to make the viewer aware that they're not only looking at something I'm looking at, but they're also looking at something that I'm kind of creating in a way that there's a sense of being aware of looking, if you will. I've always been interested in that idea that you're somehow, there's somehow a sense of self-awareness that goes on a number of levels when you decide to give yourself over to a picture. And so, a lot of the imaginative stuff combined with elements of the real can maybe start to seem, perceptual, psychedelic, kind of ruminative. They're things in your field of vision. Comments like, you've been hit upside the head here, or something. You've been hit on the side of the head. What is all this stuff floating around in my field of vision? I just think it makes us aware of how dependent we are on our vision and the visual kind of aspect of it. So, my pictures are really visual things. There's not, they often don't have much more meaning beyond that kind of, that elemental kind of a visual, pleasurable thing. So trying to fit stuff into that, and I'm one who tries to fit too many things into it. Every once in a while I get a moment of clarity, and there's less in my pictures, and that's like once every 4 years. And the rest of the time I feel like I'm putting too much, stuffing things in them, and I can't take them out because there's a personal sense of balance that I get out of it. So trying to create a sense of space, trying to relate my initial impetus for wanting to make a picture out of that thing, which is specifically mundane and boring. It's really just shapes in a building in the background. It means something to me as a starting point, but it gives me a theatrical place to kind of work from. But there are non-places, consciously non-places. But I find them kind of fascinating because they're non-places.
A moment ago, you called yourself, I think, an accidental landscape painter.
Yeah.
Which is a concept. And I'm kind of interested, I wonder if you'd explore the relationship between an idea and a material. Now you've just suggested that the material in a way takes over, if that's my words, not yours of course.
Yeah.
But this relationship between idea and material, or the materialization of an idea, can you talk about that a little bit, about the process?
Yeah, for me, when thinking about that, it's a couple steps along the way. There's the creating of forms, which might be dictated on the specific material quality, the fluidity of paint, the size of the brush, my hand, my mood, that kind of stuff. There's the sense that you want to let that material paint as if it were like some sort of alien toothpaste thing that you're just trying to get out onto a canvas, that it's got its own little, it's got its own qualities that are, that are fabulous and continually kind of intriguing, obviously to painters a lot. There's that kind of material quality, right? That idea that there's a dialogue between that, and then there's that one before it that I was talking about, where here's a form I'm trying to make, which is a mental form, which never quite comes out as you want it to, because the actual world, the material quality of the world, forces you to represent that form, forces you to kind of recognize it on its logic. And so the two kinds of logics come together, and so the idea of shape and movement and what I call kind of presentation kind of value, something's coming out at you, something's framing something, super specific in its relationship to other elements within a picture, the feeling and the angle and the direction and the speed that it might suggest, might be there, and you just try and translate it using this material. And you know, sometimes you get good at it. Sometimes it seems like the hardest thing in the world. You got to relearn it every time you haven't painted for a month or two. So that material quality wasn't as important to me, specifically in the kind of, this is I think around 2005, 2006, this painting. But up until about 4 or 5 years ago, I considered what I did more illustrational, and that the material wasn't as important as it is now. And the work I've been doing lately, broken kind of brush strokes, thicker paint, different kind of use of the material. You know, so I think of this as almost having a sensation, which I'm trying to illustrate and use the media as expediently as possible, or as well as possible. Whereas now I feel like I've kind of crossed over that line, and the media is becoming a bit more of a dictator and a bit more intriguing to me, you know, in its possibilities. So I feel like I've just kind of slipped into a different kind of mode where I used to think of painters as people who wrestled with paint. They scraped it, they scraped it off, they splashed it back on, you know, and it was a battle. I thought this is never a battle. I started painting on the left side for the viewer and worked my way across to the right side. And things happen, you try and match it up at the end and hope that there's a sense of balance, and you know, that kind of thing. When it's small, it's not as hard as when it's a big picture. But lately, that's kind of changing for me, as I've just lost as much interest in the outside world as a generator of ideas or actual places, and becoming a bit more of an imaginative kind of form generating kind of process for me. So the material often dictates more of that. And not to say that I won't, you know, have an experience in the summer, driving somewhere and go, oh wow, this is really interesting to me, this place. I really need to try and paint this. It just hasn't happened in a while, you know. And so I think, you know, the material idea back and forth can go obviously either way, but there's always an idea of communication through shape and form and a sense of becoming, which I think is in most of my work, whether it's purely kind of speculative, imaginative forms or actual kind of representations of things. There's usually a dialogue between those two things. So I feel like I'm shifting along a line here towards more interest in that materiality that I'm engaged in. You know, I never really painted when I was a student. I just drew. So, you know, it's been a learning. It's a learning curve, and continually to get what you want out of that material, to get that sensibility. I'm very traditional. I think my work is very traditional in that way, actually. So the touch and those things that a lot of, you know, modern artists kind of say, well, do we really need to be worried about that? I think that's probably what has been my fallback kind of thing, yeah.
Gary, I'd like to turn to another subject that is so often core to the question of being an artist, which is art history.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
You know, they say that past is a foreign country, but it's a foreign country that we seem to visit quite a lot. And I know that you visited Rubens.
Mm-hmm.
You have an interest in Rubens, famous painter.
Yep.
And I'm kind of interested by what you have to say about Rubens.
Well, strangely, I got interested in Rubens after I had a biography of Rubens, and I read about the first 2 chapters of it. I think I left it at a doctor's office or something, and I never got it. And it was about 2 years later that I started to become interested in his paintings, and I realized that I'd seen his landscape work as a student. I must have stumbled across a book or something like that. I just thought, it's got this sense of rippling kind of light animating this landscape, which is not unlike the landscape I live in. You go outside of Alliston, you're in amongst scattered farmers' fields with hedgerows and bushes and whatnot and shrubs, that kind of stuff. And I thought, okay, well, these two lands aren't that dissimilar, and it's hilly around here too, so you get that overview. So I think I started to see that thing in our landscape, and I really like that. He's a Baroque artist, and I mean, one thing about my work is it's kind of exudes that kind of busyness that we attribute with the Baroque, and it uses whatever interprets phenomena, like quite literally, you know, and emotionally, and I think I relate to that. There's just a sensibility that just seems really kind of present in his work that I like, and I'm not a huge, like, obviously he's known for being a figurative painter, and he's incredible at it, but, you know, I don't look at that and think I want to express what he's expressing there. I just found that his landscape work was typical, beautiful, kind of personal feeling, and just kind of magical. I just like the sensibility and you know, the traditional quality of it is always intrigued me. I just see an energy in it that I really respond to. You know, I'm from England, you know, and I've grown up with that as a background kind of noise, you know, and that whole British sensation of the countryside, the typical things that you'd you know, attribute to British ideas of the countryside. They're really kind of manufactured kind of things, the you know, Salisbury Cathedral paintings, that kind of stuff, Constable, these obvious things. But for some reason, the way Rubens has presented them, they're more dramatic. They almost seem more surreal or more hyper-real than the matter-of-factness with which you see in kind of the British representations of whatever the countryside is. I don't really know what the countryside is, to be honest with you. But I'm just really drawn to it. Just it's an energy thing. There's just something there that makes sense to me. And so now I want to get the biography back, and because he's kind of an interesting individual. But it's the Baroqueness, I think, of it that just fascinates me. It's a way to make something kind of mundane really kind of electric and fascinating. I just think he's really good at that. And but I've for a couple of years I was really interested in his work, and I was looking at it and kind of digesting it and thinking about, you know, how to present my work in a kind of modern kind of version that contains some of that sensibility. And so I went through a period where that was happening. That period seems to have kind of gone away. I'm not as interested in it, you know, or the shapes and the spaces kind of found in it. But I can look at his landscape work and ignore the whole argument, physical thing that's going on with people and characters, and I don't even see that. I just it's another thing in there. So it's just kind of peculiar enthusiasm, really, for it.
Well,
It's a sense of animation.
one thing that one knows about the Baroque is its exuberance, and you might say its attempt to reach out into space and not allow itself to be shuttered, you might say,
Right.
In a single plane. And would it be that?
Yeah, that's formally, that's kind of, you know, a way to interpret what's happening. There's a number of levels. There's that constant movement, you know, which is best exemplified through phenomena and the textures that we choose to represent them with, natural phenomena, which starts to take on emotional kind of psychological considerations. You know, I was really interested in when I was, I grew up in the 80s, I was like a teenager in the 80s. David Lynch, he uses that a lot. The kind of the vacant stand of trees, or the grass, or the sound of bugs, or, you know, he found a way to make that like a psychological field for us to, you know, examine our own nature while contemplating that nature. And I think the Baroque, you know, it makes that, it's quite obvious, really, and over the top for people who are really into art history. That's really what it's about, and that's probably the least interesting thing about it, you know. But for some people, but for me, it's, you know, it's just it's a commonality, I think, that I saw. So yeah, trying to express maybe a similar sensibility 200, 300 years on, might be what's happening.
Would you speak a little bit to some of the changes that take place from one body of work to another, and how you decide what those changes would be?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I decide. Usually it feels like almost just a battle to get to a point where you're making something you're happy with, or is kind of realized enough. if you've got the energy to do enough that you know, or do as much as you want to do. So, I flip back and forth between media. Lately I've been working in collage, so I might spend a couple months just making collages and not even paint. And then maybe I'll spend a month doing watercolors and drawing and not paint, and then all of a sudden I might be back in the studio making oil paintings for, 3 or 4 months straight and not really touch the other things. So the movement, I think sometimes what's happened over the last little while and is that the kind of negative spaces around the collage montage kind of things I've been making, it's kind of found its way into some of the shapes that have intrigued me with painting, and that they become more letter form oriented, they become more kind of overtly symbolic. Here's a shape that might suggest a certain thing, a certain structure, which is kind of arbitrary or imaginative. And so I think one thing has influenced the other, in that the things I'm doing in one medium kind of feed into another medium. So the paintings that I'm doing recently, I can almost consciously feel like I was trying to get some of the sensibility that my watercolor work had, just in terms of its openness and its kind of, well, it's a broken brushstroke kind of thing, but it's like hard to explain. But I feel that that's been one of the things I've been trying to put into my paintings lately. But just because it's an identifiable aesthetic that feels like I can express it at this point, where sometimes I look at what I have done and think I wouldn't even know where to start if I was to do that. Unfortunately, you do end up with a vocabulary that becomes hard to escape, even when you want to escape it. And so that's happened. That's a battle I have on a daily basis. And then you start painting and it starts going well, and you just kind of get lost into it, and you feel like you're starting to get to the point of what it was you were trying to express. But that's not always, easy. I don't know why. It just, sometimes you're just not there. You're not open to it, or you're in a different space and trying to make it into something it's not. That's where I find that part gets harder, moving in between bodies of work. But usually I have a pretty distinct idea about the kinds of shapes and forms and sensibilities I'm trying to kind of realize. And that even comes out just in sketching, in the idea generating, doodling kind of phase of it, which is a daily kind of thing for me. But not consciously I'm making art, I'm just sketching out ideas, that kind of thing. So those little steps towards a bigger idea seem to generate what eventually comes out, and 6 months later you've got enough work for a show or something like that. Or that's what you end up doing with it, or you don't, and you turn it around and it faces the wall and never sees the light of day again, which is what some of these pieces might end up being. You just yeah. So it's not conscious, because I think it's a similar idea. Similar ideas are kind of rolling through it. I might explore texture more, I might explore shape or place more, and they just kind of moved through that cycle without too much forethought. At times it's really almost trying to just keep painting. I've got to come out here and force myself to work at it for a while, because eventually something will happen and you'll think, okay, I'm starting to describe something here, and it can be hard to analyze it and be part of that thing. Sometimes you just got to get out here and do it and take what you're doing as, well, this is what I've got right now, how can I make it better, what can I move to, and before you know it, you're somewhere you didn't even envision. So
Roland Barthes once said there's no theory without a practice, and no practice without a theory. And I hesitate to ask the question, because I'm not sure that you have particular regard for formal theory, but do you have any sense of the relationship between your practice and theory?
No. The short answer would be no. I don't really, I think I have pretty kind of vague ideas, and they usually hinge on what I'd call universal concepts of, movement, expansion, texture, things that have been the rudiments of, people trying to express themselves in 2 dimensions forever probably. And in that much really, trying to capture movement. I mean, that's in the first paintings ever, right? Here's a herd of buffalo running by. I'm trying to capture movement. I'm just trying to capture a different kind of movement. So has that changed any? So I think because they're kind of vague, basic, felt connections to the material, I do find things occasionally I'm thinking, oh, this makes sense. These ideas around perception or these ideas around focal points. I'll see something and read it and think, oh yeah, I get that. That's kind of what I'm trying to do. Who wrote it? Do I read it again and again? No, but I'm always reading things that fascinate me. But they don't become kind of doctrinary for me in any way. And so I sometimes consciously try not to think about that side of it for fear that it will get in the way of the natural expressive side of it. One of the things that I found when I went to art school, in the 80s, is that I met lots of people who were, I would say, naturally more expressive than me. I was somebody who was good at drawing houses and, things that look like things. Who I call really expressive people, fascinating use of color. And you could see the not the life, but you could see that energy getting drained out of them, replaced with things that I would call kind of theory driven. And we used to joke that if you just end up taking black and white photographs and putting some text on them or something like that, that you'd end up being able to have a dialogue with your teachers at a level that they wanted you, because they could see how theory drives representation so much more than the 21-year-old student could. And so, but I saw students whose work kind of changed in that, some for the better, some for the worse. So I was always skeptical about, about being overtly conceptual about things that I wasn't really sure of or didn't really experience, because I just don't have that kind of mind, I found things along the way that have been meaningful. Can I bring them up for you right now? If we were having a longer conversation about that, I'm sure I'd start to see, I'd start to be able to find some things that were specific. But there's not really anything that's ever really guided me that way. I find the incredible simplicity of, like let's say folk music or something like that, somebody playing a thumb piano can be absolutely, enriching and fascinating and deep and meaningful on a really human level, and mean more to me than, pages and pages of things that, are speaking about really, it really becomes a question of language, I think, right? Theory starts to get into the heart of why we have ideas, how language forms. And for me, I find it often ends up being in that area. That's fascinating and great to talk about and great to study and great to pass on to people. But it doesn't really animate my work in that way, so. So that's typical painter's answer. No.
Well, I wonder what a typical painter's answer to this one is going to be. As we all know, being an artist or operating as an artist is also operating within a discourse. Several discourses, of course, actually, but it's very often brought down into, I guess for simplicity purposes, the question, well, what is the current discourse? What is the zeitgeist within which we're operating?
Out there? Yeah.
Well, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I look at contemporary art continually online, not as much in person or in personally as I'd like to, just because of where I live, but I do see as much as I can. I think we're in a weird time in that we are cycling through vocabularies quite quickly. We're at a, certainly in painting, there's a great movement towards the early modern period, simpler geometries, simpler forms of expression, an open-endedness to everything that is really kind of refreshing and wonderful, but also kind of difficult and confusing. I see a lot of artists, I think, well, obviously you really enjoy Matisse's work, and you know, and that kind of stuff, and I can see those trends going through that. You know, every once in a while they start kicking around, you know, different ideas come around, relational aesthetics, zombie formalism, whatever those were, or whatever they are, because, you know, there were real things that happened. But certainly there's a real kind of expressiveness about a lot of contemporary art that's really intriguing, and I just like the fact that it continually kicks off labels at this point and tries to be something else. Whether it's as profound and interesting is another story, because you could see the market creeping into some practices and people becoming enamored with a certain way of expressing themselves. But when you see something real that, you know, it often, for me, often stands out as somebody's really engaged with this thought. So the contemporary painting, I try to tell people who aren't interested in art that, yeah, I make contemporary landscape painting. Well, what's contemporary landscape painting? Well, you know, they don't know, but I could say, well, I could think of 3 or 4 people that I know personally who are probably doing a much better job at it than I am, and whose work intrigues me and fascinates me and kind of spurs me on. But they don't know that because they're not inside this kind of bubble of the art world. So I think there's trends inside the art world, because it's a very hermetic system, that artists are aware of. The outside world will never be aware of them, never catch up, couldn't care less about them, it's of no interest. And that kind of fascinates me, that kind of split. So I try and stay on top of these things. I say that the zeitgeist at this point is just this unending openness, a latching on to formal qualities that were first explored in the early modern kind of period, because they're almost, you know, I don't know, prototypical responses to the condition we find ourselves in. And they're comforting and conservative kind of choices when all you see around you socially is an onslaught of, you know, of splintered versions of reality. There's no there anymore. And I feel that, you know, the recycling of past ideas is a kind of postmodern condition, because there's no there, because there's just an endless stream of things filtering past your eyes or on your news stream or whatever it is. Kind of takes us into kind of conservative, familiar places. We try and regenerate them in light of the contemporary condition of what I call splinteredness, you know, or fractured kind of reality. So there's a conservative notion there, but also one, I think, of survival, because I just don't know how people can absorb the amount of information that's out there and make sense of it, especially people who are trying to continually keep up with it, you know, and haven't had that moment where they're just saying, oh, enough already. So, yeah, I don't know if that's much of an answer.
Great answer. Leads to 2 things, actually, Gary. On the one side, I'd love to hear your views on the art system itself, or at least those parts of the art system that you find yourself in contact with, or those parts of the art system that you view from afar, as we all do. On the one side, and on the other side, of course, the general public, and how you understand your work operating with respect to that general public. And you've raised that in the question of the relationship to the zeitgeist and so on and so forth. So let's start with the art system.
Okay.
Any thoughts about it?
Yeah, it's intriguing. You know, I always say to students, it's a world not unlike fashion or music. You know, it's got its gatekeepers, it's got its rules, it's got its behaviors, it's got its way of communicating with itself. But because it's not fashion or music, and it's not as accessible to everybody, it's a very like I said, I think I used the word hermetic, it's a very kind of concealed thing, and it's very hard for people to feel what it is that's going on until they get to know the gatekeepers and get to know the places and get to know why things happen the way they do. So it's very confusing for the outside person. I think it's a very conservative system full of really incredibly liberal, wonderful people. I think it's an intensely hierarchical system. I think it's very old-fashioned in that we need justification from on high to continue doing what we do, and that can be really annoying and troubling to people who don't feel that they can get to the inside point of it. I find that people who aren't in the art world don't have any time for it. They just look at it and go, "Oh, this is a world that's rife with pretension." I said, well, it's not true, because there's lots of wonderful things and great ideas and beautiful people and wonderful work and creativity that's driving a lot of other stuff that you don't even realize happening all the time. But yet it's, I have more friends who are not artists than friends who are artists. So, I can see it from both sides quite comfortably, because, whenever I ask them to come to one of my receptions or openings, sometimes they're just absolutely shocked, or they come to see my work, at a gallery or at a regional art center or something like that. Well, why didn't anybody talk to me? How come the person behind the desk was so remote or something like that? These are general terms that students and non kind of art world people come across. I think Canada's an interesting one in that we don't have the great British habit of popularizing eccentrics. In Britain, there's the Grayson Perrys and the Tracy Emin's of the world who are like beloved national eccentrics who might infuriate and entertain at the same time, as well as make great art, which gets talked about. I'm not saying it's totally that way there, because a lot of people, we don't have time for that either. But in Canada we don't celebrate eccentrics like I would say the European kind of habit of it. And so I think it has a hard time publicizing itself. There's certainly people around there thinking, well, why isn't Carol Wayne and Stephen Andrews, why aren't they nationally known people? Why don't people know about these people? I'm fascinated by them. They're great artists. But yet we just don't make a point of doing that, and so I think it has a hard time publicizing itself. But what's neat for me, or interesting to me over the last 10-15 years, is that the public is buying into the art experience on a community level as a kind of social experiment in a way that's never happened before. Whereas it might not be, let's go to the museum and look at pictures, but there's things happening in small communities on an ever more expanding basis that are helping to create art as a social entity, not as an aesthetic thought field of kind of expression, but as a social practice. And you're seeing artists shift their practice towards that, what I'd call a social basis, where they see advocacy, community engagement, working on a smaller, more personal level with children, social groups, whatever they are, as enough reason to make art and be involved. So it's great because it's taking that hierarchy out of the picture and engaging people on a more open, a broad-based level of expression and connectivity. But at the same time, we may be missing some of the bigger messages that really good, profound art is able to transmit. But they're out there. You need to engage with them. It's just my little view of the world here. They're out there, and you can engage with them. But maybe the function of art is changing as we kind of become more of an image-based society in a generic way. It's less profound. So it's moving into a more social kind of thing, and it's hard to be cynical. It's hard for me to be cynical about that, and I can be cynical just about anything. But I find that's one of the good movements that's happening in the art world, and certainly governments and arts councils and granting agencies have done a lot to promote that inclusivity, and I'm very thankful for that. but the art world that generates money and hype and kind of feeds on itself still remains a labyrinthine, separate boat floating off the island of reality here, you know, a little thing unto itself. I don't begrudge it, because I could go in comfortably in between worlds, you know, so I'm lucky that way. But certainly I watch with amusement my students trying to put their hands around it. It's like, what? Why won't they look at my work? Why won't they talk to me? Why won't they answer these basic questions?
So the public, it's interesting what you say, Gary, because in some respects you're talking about a slow convergence between many parts of the art system, let's say, and the general public, as though you might say each of them are moving towards a center of some kind, whatever the more rarefied aspects of the art system might be doing. So back to your own work, though, and how you see the general public with respect to it.
Yeah, I've been very, very fortunate in that my work, I think, is approachable, because people look at it and they think, oh, it's kind of like trees, it's kind of like natural shapes. I can relate to that. I can see it. Most people, you know, can have the idea of, well, it's about life, it's about energy, it's about shapes, those kinds of things. And I mean, I had lots of wonderful conversations with people who, you know, painting, you know, okay, sure, these are paintings, and most people actually have quite sophisticated ways of reading it, you know, and it's really interesting. But I think I've been lucky because there's an approachable aspect to my work, because it does take on, either for them, an imaginative kind of proposition, oh, here's a mystery kind of Tolkien-esque kind of world, or it exudes a kind of, you know, the same kind of vitality, hopefully, that the outside world does, which is ostensibly my subject matter, so they can connect to me for that. Or some of the more kind of, you know, psychedelic, weird kind of things. It's not hard for them to see how one might imagine these things based on all the models that are out there for them to kind of, you know, think of it in that way. So, you know, those roads can lead you to science fiction, or they can lead you to, you know, kind of a mystical, magical realism thing, which are two things that I'm not at all interested in, even though it would be easy for me to describe my work in those terms. And so I think I've been very fortunate that way, in that there's a general level of accessibility to what's interested me. And so people will come in the studio who really haven't seen what I'm doing. They, you know, most people can get it in some way, and we've had wonderful conversations. I don't put things in my work which aren't there, you know, but it's the kind of work people look at it and look at differently a second time, and then see something they never saw the third time, and all of a sudden, you know, oh, that's a face, or this, you know, those kinds of things that we put onto work as we look at it, that reveal something about your own kind of psychology. You know, I think it's easy work for that to happen. So I think I'm kind of fortunate in that way, even though that might not be what I'm trying to do. It's never been a struggle to get people to kind of, you know, buy in or talk to me about it. But I know it's very different for a lot of artists. So I think
there's the general public, and then there's the collector. And of course you're with Paul, and consequently you're in touch with collectors. Do you have a sense of what constitutes a collector, or the relationship collectors have to your work?
I think it's interesting, because it's very stratified based on, you know, how much spare change you've got and what else you're engaged in. So I mean, one of the great gratifying things for me was how the corporate world and people that, you know, might have been kind of, you know, I might have looked at another way, you know, as a younger person, have support and buy into it and are active participants in purchasing contemporary art. I had no idea. That was a real eye-opener to me when I realized that, well, there's corporations are buying artwork, and lots of it, and really interesting stuff. And so that was kind of fascinating to come across that. And certainly it's always really gratifying to know that, you know, somebody might buy 1 or 2 pieces of art a year, because really that's all they can afford. And they've chosen something that you've done, and they feel very passionately about it. Or, you know, they can only afford it when there's a, you know, a Christmas sale of smaller versions of your work or something, and they really want something, and they show this genuine enthusiasm for it. So there's like small level collector, kind of, you know, medium level collector, people who collect for social responsibility like corporations and law offices and banks and whatnot, who do a great job of you know, representing Canadian culture in their own little way. And then there's people who have lots of money and buy work and buy great work and take risks on people, and I've certainly met those people who I'm thinking, wow, I'm thrilled to be hanging next to what I'm hanging next to in your house. And then there's people who buy things because they're really expensive, and it's good to buy stuff that's expensive, and there's that level. And you know, there's some amazing people out there who are just so passionate about it, who fall into a lot of those categories all at once. They just love it. They love art, they love collecting, they love ideas, they love sharing it. And so I think I've met people in all those different levels, and that's interesting. You know, to be in public collections is always a thrill. So, you know, a regional art center wants one of your pieces, or I find that really gratifying as well.
Gary, you teach.
I do.
And you have, I guess, for some time. What is it about teaching that attracts you? Of course, let me say this. Teaching is one way of supporting oneself as an artist. We all know that,
Yeah.
and we all know that artists, generally speaking, need to have a day job.
Mm-hmm.
And teaching is one of those great day jobs.
It is.
But it does lead also to another question I'd like to ask, which is the pressures that are on an artist to build a career and
Right.
maintain it.
Yeah.
But I want to keep those two questions separately. So first, let's talk about teaching and what it is that you enjoy about it.
It's, you know, there's just a wonderful kind of vibrancy to the whole process. It's incredible to watch somebody come in and then leave 3 or 4 years later with just so, you know, so many more skills, or just such a great handle on things. It's really gratifying on so many levels. I actually physically enjoy the process of teaching and standing in front of people and talking about things and working through ideas and giving feedback. You know, I like talking to people. I'm probably sometimes one of the quieter people maybe at a social gathering, but you know, if I'm forced to stand in front of somebody, I'm quite happy speaking. I don't feel it's a problem. So I do enjoy the actual act of it. I like presenting ideas, you know, and I like, you know, talking about techniques or what might work for those things. It's a really wonderful thing to be able to share that kind of stuff. I didn't ever think I'd be a teacher, but I always thought I'd like to teach. So when I finished art school, you don't know what you're going to do. So, you know, I fell into a job as a social worker. Literally, when we moved to Alliston, I was a social worker for probably, 12 years before I started teaching kind of part-time at the same time, and then situations arose and I found myself teaching full-time. So I did kind of fall into it a little bit, but it felt very comfortable from the starting point. It's funny teaching art, you know. People always ask, "Oh, how can you mark art? And how can you be?" It's so subjective. Well, it is subjective, but if you've seen 3,000 of these things, then you probably have a good barometer of levels of experience. But you know, first day, first slide, you know. Whatever, I show them a Michelangelo and a Basquiat and say, you know, one of them's worth $50 million, which one do you think it is? Well, it was the graffiti one, right? So that kind of matrix or that scale of worth is an interesting thing in the art world. So if you can get people expressing themselves innately and building on those skills to kind of, you know, make them aware of what's out there, make them aware of conceptually what they might come up against. Yeah, it's a really interesting process. And teaching on that basic level is really fun and really enjoyable. So I'm fortunate that I found myself teaching. Like I said, it wasn't the big plan. I really didn't have a big plan. You know, so I'm lucky. You know, some of the other stuff of being in an institution, I'm sure that can get in your way, and you just gotta not take it with too much. Yeah.
So what's it like to maintain a career?
Well, I mean, my career's been, you know, it's almost like you've had a career. I've been painting for 20 years. First off, it was a series of lucky experiences to find a dealer who liked my work and thought there was something there that he could work with, or they could work with that meant something to them. They actually really thought I had something to say, and they were happy to be part of letting people know about it. That was great. So I haven't really done a lot of mobility around that. I was a social worker when I started that. Now I'm a teacher and I'm still doing that. You know, I've had shows here and there. I've had a couple of kind of, you know, regional arts center tour type shows, which have been absolutely fantastic experiences. But you know, about 10 years ago, if you'd asked me this question, I thought, well, you know, I'd really love to have a show in New York. I'd really love to have a show in London. You know, I'm thinking, how can I do this? I gave up on that about 10 years ago because I'm thinking, oh, whatever happens, happens. I'd really like to have a show in England just because I'm from England, and that's still a goal. But the rest of the art world, I've just completely given up on. So I realized that, yeah, you know, you're in a regional kind of art experience, and that career, sometimes you sell a few things, sometimes you don't sell anything, and sometimes, you know, you just struggle to find a place to exhibit your work and make it and do that kind of thing. So I'm very fortunate in that I've been able to continually realize that, which doesn't happen to everybody. And I know some incredible artists who I think, I just don't understand why somebody doesn't look at this and go, of course I want to show that. You know, and we all know those people. And so, you know, sometimes it just never makes any sense. So the career has been a kind of weird thing for me because I've never applied for, I applied for one grant once. I think that was a travel grant or something like that. So I don't really apply for grants. I don't really think about, I can do this, because I don't really ever have a project. My project is kind of ongoing. If I wasn't teaching, I probably would have tried to access that part of the system to support my career, but I've always worked, and I work full time. So finding time to get out here and spend a few hours on the painting when that's kind of what's happening, that's the challenge. You know, to get a day to be in the studio all day, and that never happens. You know, I mean, it's a rare experience. But if I had all day to do it, you know, sometimes I'm really productive, sometimes I'm not. I think I actually might get more done in 2-hour increments than if I had all day every day to do it. So, and I'm also know that if I can stay busy, I'll be busier. That's just proven, you know, so I'm happy to have other things to do in my life, you know, other than make art, because I think it helps make art. So the career, it's a work in progress, but it seems to be kind of going whatever it is.
The question of the artist often raises the question of originality, of something unique, something authentic. And these words may now ring a little bit historic, but nonetheless they still seem to have potency. I wonder if you have any thoughts about the question of what is fundamental or what is authentic when it comes to making art, and how you view your own work through that lens.
That's a really tricky question. I think what I do is really quite traditional. I think it has the look of the traditional, even though it might be kind of, you know, slightly something different. I always felt it important to look towards that place where it felt kind of a genuine expression, and sometimes that becomes the most ridiculous and trite thing in the world to do, because you know you've already visited this territory before and you're just kind of parroting yourself, if you will. But I still feel that's an essential idea, that you need to find some originality in the feeling that's generating those things. I mean, the touch and the hand thing that people would say, oh, that looks like something Gary did. You know, I think that's because there's a traditional aspect to it and a traditional way of seeing the world, which makes it maybe easier for some people to look at. Is it original? I don't know if it's original. Just try and battle with kind of keeping it real and genuine. But I mean, it really is, you know, an 18th century idea. You know, I always say I've only had 2 ideas, and I've just been bashing them over the head relentlessly since I started this thing. And you know, that no matter what you do, that never seems to change. You know, and I still wouldn't know how to characterize that, but it has something to do with trying to present a visual model that is kind of full of the vitality of, you know, our experience in the world and my experience in the world, and hope that other people can relate to it. And I know lots of people can't. They look at it and go, I don't get it, busy, flowery, whatever. I don't see what you're trying to suggest. But it is really kind of basic. And along the way, I think I've had moments where I thought, okay, this feels fresh, and you get a kind of conversation going about it where you feel like, okay, this is moving something along a little bit, but it's very small. The increments of movement are very small. I don't really know what true originality is, but I know people who are super original, and they do remarkable, amazing things, and I wouldn't say I'm over there. I'm not, it's a very conservative world. Paint, canvases, that kind of stuff. It's very old-fashioned, I think, what I do, and conservative with maybe some, whatever, I don't know, my own ideas, which I try and find a way to express something genuine. But it is a conservative thing I'm doing. I'm conservative. I'm using that word not politically, but just in terms of it's pictures, paint, canvas, expressionism. It's not earth-shattering. So I don't know if that makes sense or not.